Isn't it the worst when your girlfriend, your wife, your mom, your friend asks you on Sunday, "What's wrong? Why are you being so grumpy? Why are you not talking?" And you don't want to tell them it's because your fantasy football team is failing you right now. All your star players are not scoring fantasy points because if you tell them, they're going to be like, "Oh, fantasy football doesn't matter. No one cares about your fantasy team." It just literally makes everything worse. If you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. But if you have any of these guys in this video, you're going to be able to breathe on Sunday. You're going to be feeling good. You're going to be happy. You're going to take out the trash if your girlfriend asks you to do so, because these 10 players in this video are going to go off in week 11 of fantasy football. Let's start with my bold call of the week, and it's Sean Tucker, running back for the Tampa Bay Bucks, who's really starting to heat up over these last couple of weeks as he's outrushed Rachaad White for the second week in a row. 9 carries for 53 yards in week 10 for Tucker, compared to Rachaad White, who rushed 10 times for 38 yards, 3.8 yards per carry. Tucker has seen 40% of the team's rush attempts in back-to-back weeks. You got to think at this point that number is only going to continue to grow. We know Bucky Irving returned to practice. We don't know when he's going to be back. He's out this week. So we know Tucker is going to be very involved this week, and he's clearly the Bucs' best option on the ground. And let's not forget, when Tucker is featured, he's shown us in the past what he's capable of, what he can do, and it's pretty impressive. Week 6 of last year, if you remember, he went crazy. 14 carries, 136 yards, a touchdown, 3 receptions for 56 yards, another touchdown, 34.2 fantasy points. I think this is a really special back that would probably be the starter on many other NFL teams. It just happens that he's buried behind 2 pretty good running backs. I could see the Bucs leaning on the run game as well in week 11, run the ball, drain the clock, keep Josh Allen off the field. That's probably going to be their strategy, and I think it could really work against Buffalo, who has given up the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season and just allowed Devon Achane to run wild all over them last week. 174 yards and 2 touchdowns for Achane. If you're desperate for a high upside flex play this week, I would be looking no further than Mr. Sean Tucker. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jaylen Waddle, who's been a bright spot on this Miami offense as of late. He's clearly taken over as the clear-cut alpha wide receiver 1 since Tyreek Hill went down. Waddle is the wide receiver 4 in fantasy since week 4, averaging 16 fantasy points per game, 25% target per route run rate, 3rd in yards per route run behind only Puka Nacua and Jackson Smith-Njigba. He's top 10 in average separation score. This is an elite receiver who I think can be a fantasy superstar down the stretch. He's a guy that I'd be trying to trade for now before this week, because I think after this week, it's going to be pretty impossible to do so. We know Waddle's coming off a big game against the Bills in week 10, 5 receptions, 84 yards, a touchdown on 7 targets, 19.4 fantasy points. And don't be surprised if Waddle puts together his best game of the season in week 11 against the Washington Commanders, who have allowed the most yards and 3rd most fantasy points per game to receivers this season. Waddle should crush one of the worst secondaries in all of football in London on Sunday morning. 8 receptions, over 100 yards, and a touchdown seems like a lock at this point for Waddle in week 11. All right, moving on to our next guy, Woody Marks, who we've been begging this Texans coaching staff for weeks now to just feature Marks on this offense, and it looks like it finally, fingers crossed, might be happening. Season high 78% of the snaps in week 10 for the rookie, 55% of the routes run, 16 of the team's 22 running back touches, and they want to use Woody in the red zone. They don't want to use Nick Chubb. Marks had 4 carries inside the 10. Chubb had 0. And we know last week Marks finished with 14 carries for 63 yards, a touchdown, 4.5 yards per carry, 2 receptions for 18 yards, 16.1 fantasy points. And what's even crazier is that I feel really good about Nico Collins, Woody Marks, this entire Houston Texans offense this week, because Davis Mills is the QB1. Like, what kind of world are we living in? That's how bad CJ Stroud has been this year. We know he's out again this week, dealing with a concussion, but last week, Davis Mills was pretty impressive, and everyone on offense played really well. And what's even more encouraging is Woody had his best game in week 4 against this Tennessee Titans defense. 21 touches, 119 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and 27.9 fantasy points. I would be starting Marks with a ton of confidence this week against the Tennessee Titans, who are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, along with a league-high 14 total touchdowns to the position. So Woody Marks, the arrow is pointing straight up. If Houston continues to feed him the football, he will be a league winner down the stretch. All right, moving on to our next guy, T. Higgins, who's been absolutely balling since Joe Flacco came to town in week 6, as Higgins is the wide receiver 5, averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game, along with sporting a 22% first read share, 31% air yard share, and has earned 4 red zone targets and 6 deep targets over that span. T is also coming off a monster performance in week 9 before the Bengals had their bye. 7 receptions, 129 yards, 2 touchdowns, 33.1 fantasy points. And it's obvious that T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Chase Brown could not be happier that Jake Browning is no longer the QB1, because Flacco, the 40-year-old, is playing out of his mind right now, as he led the NFL in passing yards per game and touchdown passes from weeks 6 to 9. Like, what kind of simulation are we in right now? Who would have saw that coming? Definitely not me. And I think T is going to stay hot in week 11 against the Steelers, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game and 2nd most yards to receivers this season. And we saw in week 7, T had a nice game against the Steelers defense already. 6 receptions, 96 yards, found the end zone, 21.6 fantasy points. And we get the enjoyment, the entertainment of watching Unk Bowl 2.0 between Joe Flacco and Aaron Rodgers, 2 40-year-olds squaring off. It's going to be a thing of beauty yet again. I would be leaving Higgins in your starting lineup. Feel really good about it. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jaylen Warren. This is another guy who I think is going to have his best game of the season, but I do have one issue. It's with this coaching staff. What are we doing? Steelers, if you want to start winning more football games, maybe unleash one of your best players on offense. I don't know. Like, Jalen's snap share on the year right now is at 58%. That is absolutely unacceptable, considering you just don't have much on offense. You struggle week to week on offense. What are we doing here? Like, literally stop giving Kenneth Gainwell snaps. It's ridiculous. Go all in on one of the most underrated running backs in football. And Warren currently ranks 3rd in missed tackles forced per attempt and has scored double-digit fantasy points in 6 out of 8 games. Imagine what this man could do for the Steelers, for your fantasy football team, if he just was on the field more, if he had a bigger role on this offense. He's averaging 17 opportunities per game right now. Like, it's not terrible, but I would like that number to be north of 20 opportunities per game. I'm not really sure it's going to matter, though, this week against a really bad Cincinnati Bengals defense, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. And before their bye, the Bengals got crushed by 7th-round rookie Kyle Monangai, who went for 176 yards on the ground. And Warren has already had success against this defense in week 7. He scored a season-high 19.8 fantasy points, so he's likely in for another monster performance. I would be firing up Warren. Obviously, you're starting him, right? But I'd be excited about it because I think he could finish in the top 5 at the position in week 11. All right, moving on to our next guy, Jameson Williams, who might have just been fully unlocked by Dan Campbell, who thankfully took over the play calling last week. And JMO looked like a completely different player out there because they actually used him correctly. He went for 6 receptions, 119 yards, a touchdown on 7 targets, 23.9 fantasy points. And they used JMO on crossers, on slant routes. He wasn't just running deep literally on every single play. They were using him in space so he can utilize his speed, his elusiveness after the catch. Now, I will say, to be fair, Williams was going up against one of the worst secondaries in football in the Washington Commanders, but I don't think it really matters because we know the talent at this point of Jameson Williams. He's really good. It's always just been an issue of not getting the football, not seeing enough targets. But if Dan Campbell continues to call the plays, which he said he's going to, then This is another guy where the arrow is pointing straight up for the explosive receiver because offensive coordinator John Morton, who gushed about Williams all offseason, raved that he's going to have this breakout year, didn't know how to utilize him. Literally did not know how to utilize him. Dan Campbell, much different story. And the matchup on Sunday Night Football against the Eagles is going to be a good one. Yeah, it's less than ideal. Philadelphia has a good secondary, but not overly concerned about it. It's going to be a high-scoring matchup. No Sam Laporta in this one, so Jameson is going to see plenty of volume, a ton of targets, and it would not shock me at all if Williams gets behind the defense for a 50-yard touchdown and has 5, 6+ catches to go with it. So fire up Jameson. Yet again, what he's doing is far from a fluke, and I think he's going to continue to stay hot on Sunday Night Football. All right, moving on to our next guy, Aaron Jones, who's looking like he retained the RB1 role in Minnesota over these last 2 weeks, 77% of the snaps in week 9 before injuring his shoulder, 72% of the snaps in week 10, 100% of the snaps inside the 5, 94% of the 2-minute offense. And over that span, he's combined for 167 total yards, 7.26 yards per touch, and a touchdown. And he put together a strong performance in week 10, 9 carries, 47 yards, found the end zone, 5.2 yards per carry, and chipped in 3 receptions for 22 yards on 6 targets, 15.9 fantasy points. Jones has been a top 20 fantasy back in all 3 of his healthy games this year, and he's passed the eye test. Like, he's an older back, 30 years old, but he looks like vintage Aaron Jones. He looks extremely explosive, and the numbers don't lie. He ranks 3rd in explosive run rate since week 9. And Jones brings an element of explosiveness, versatility, juice to this Vikings offense that Jordan Mason didn't exactly do. I think that it would be smart for Minnesota to feature the running game going forward, take some pressure off J.J. McCarthy, get him comfortable back in his Michigan days where they just ran the football a ton. Obviously, they're going to throw to Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, but I think running a lot would also be a good thing because Aaron Jones is playing really well and gets a nice matchup in week 11 against the Bears, who are allowing 4.9 yards per carry, which is the 5th most in the NFL. And I think Jones is going to have another strong performance, and he has week-winning upside if Minnesota features him in week 11. All right, moving on to our next guy, Devontae Smith. At least one Philadelphia Eagles receiver has been cooking this year, and it has not been A.J. Brown, unfortunately, for some of my fantasy teams, but Smith is the wide receiver 13 in fantasy points per game and is sporting a 26% target share, 32% first read share, 37% air yard share, 6 red zone targets, and leads the team with 13 deep targets. And over the last month, Smith is 3rd in receiving yards per game at 112 behind Jamar Chase and Jackson Smith-Njigba, and is coming off another nice game in week 10, 4 catches, 69 yards, a touchdown on 7 targets, 16.9 fantasy points. And Smith has scored 14 plus fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. The Eagles are going to need all of Smitty on Sunday Night Football if they want to keep up with one of the best offenses in football in the Detroit Lions. And I do think Smith is going to come through in a big way for the Eagles against this Lions secondary that's very beatable, as they rank 27th against fantasy receivers this season. And since week 6, they have allowed the 6th most receiving yards per game and 12th most PPR points per target to slot receivers. All right, moving on to our next guy, James Cook, who's coming off a rough game in a smash spot versus the Dolphins last week. It was pretty disappointing as he only finished with 13 carries for 53 yards, 4.1 yards per carry. He fumbled 5 receptions for 24 yards. He salvaged his day a little bit in the receiving game, but still only 10.7 fantasy points. Now, to be fair, everyone on this Buffalo Bills offense struggled, Josh Allen included. But let's be honest, Cook is still on his way to a career year as he's 2nd in rushing right now at 920 yards behind Jonathan Taylor, but he has cooled off drastically after a scorching hot start to the season and now has back-to-back very average fantasy performances and has scored 13.5 or fewer fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. But if you are a Cook owner, I would not be panicking just yet. I am expecting a pretty big fantasy game from the talented running back in week 11. He's likely going to be the focal point of this Bills offense. He needs to be the focal point of this offense because they don't have much. And they're going to be down one of their biggest weapons on offense in tight end Dalton Kincaid, who's dealing with a hamstring injury. And I do think that Cook is going to have a massive bounce back performance on Sunday and run all over this Tampa Bay Bucs defense that's allowing 24 PPR fantasy points per game to running backs and just got steamrolled by TreVeyon Henderson in week 10 as he went off for 14 carries for 147 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 28 fantasy points. Cook should absolutely torch this Bucs defense this week. All right, moving on to our next guy, Ladd McConkey, who, let's face it, he's the Chargers' bona fide wide receiver 1. After a rocky start to the year, he's been absolutely incredible from weeks 1 to 4. Wide receiver 56 in fantasy, but since week 5, he's the wide receiver 9, averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game, 24% target share, 23% first read share, 2.23 yards per route run, and leads the Chargers in like literally every category: targets, receptions, yards, air yards, end zone targets, and touchdowns. And Ladd is coming off one of his best performances in week 10, 4 receptions, 107 yards, a touchdown, 6 targets, 20.7 fantasy points. And that route that he ran on that touchdown that he scored, if you were watching against the Steelers, was absolutely filthy. The defensive back literally just like froze. Ladd hit him with the double move and he stood no chance. That's who Ladd is. He is one of the best route runners in the NFL right now, and he's become a must-start receiver and should have another big game against this Jacksonville Jaguars defense, who have allowed the 13th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season, along with the second most touchdowns to the position in the last month. So I love Ladd. Yet again, if you stuck with him, if you bought him low, kudos to you, because he is in for a monster second half of the year, similar to what we saw in his rookie season. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, subscribe to the channel, comment down below. Let's get a win this week, and I'll see you in the next one.